FastTrackAI here, back again. But today we're shifting gears. Welcome to a deep research special report, where we dive beyond the headlines, myths, and mysteries to uncover hidden truths. Today's mystery, the legendary Piri Reis Map. Is it just an old piece of parchment or proof of lost knowledge from a civilization forgotten by history? Let's set sail into the unknown and find out. The Piri Reis Map and the question of ancient Antarctic geography. Introduction. The Piri Reis Map is a 1513 world map compiled by Ottoman admiral Piri Reis on gazelle skin parchment. It famously displays the Atlantic Ocean with the coastlines of Western Europe, West Africa, and the recently discovered Americas. Because only a fragment, about 1/3 of the map, survives, the portion we have mainly shows the eastern coast of South America and the western coast of Africa. The map is remarkably detailed for its time, incorporating information from about 20 source charts, including maps by Columbus and Portuguese explorers, as noted in its inscriptions. In the decades since its 1929 rediscovery, the Piri Reis Map has been embroiled in controversy and pseudo-scientific claims. Chief among these is the assertion that Piri Reis's map depicts Antarctica, specifically an ice-free Antarctic coastline, as it might have appeared in remote antiquity, around the last glacial maximum, 20,000 years ago. This claim suggests that an advanced prehistoric civilization, or other extraordinary source, charted Antarctica long before its official discovery in 1820. In this investigation, we will evaluate these claims against historical cartography and modern geological knowledge, including comparisons of the map's southern land with paleogeographic reconstructions of Earth at the last glacial maximum, LGM. We will also examine whether any features on the map correspond to known submerged lands from the LGM and summarize scholarly perspectives supporting or debunking the idea that the Piri Reis Map preserves accurate ancient knowledge of Earth's geography. Figure. Surviving portion of the Piri Reis World Map, 1513. This fragment shows the Atlantic with parts of the Americas, left, and Africa, right. Notably, at the bottom left, the map's depiction of South America's coast bends sharply eastward, terminating in a landmass drawn across the bottom. A feature later theorized to represent an ice-free Antarctica. The Piri Reis Map's content and southern regions. Historically, Piri Reis's map was a product of its era's geographical knowledge fused with older sources. Piri Reis himself noted that he compiled it from about 20 charts and mappae mundi, including 8 maps from the time of Alexander the Great, an Arabic map of India, 4 recent Portuguese maps, and even a map drawn by Columbus of the Western lands. Modern historians interpret the Alexander the Great era maps as a likely reference to Claudius Ptolemy's ancient geography, which Piri appears to have misunderstood as dating to Alexander's time. The resulting composite map is drawn in a Portolan chart style, with rhumb lines and compass roses instead of a latitude-longitude grid. Despite some distortions, many parts of the map are surprisingly accurate. For example, the west coasts of Africa and Europe and the east coast of South America are mapped with fair precision for 1513. Rivers like the Amazon are sketched, and island groups like the Azores, Canaries, and Cape Verde are placed reasonably correctly. These accuracies reflect Piri's access to the latest discoveries of the age of exploration and perhaps intelligence gathered from captured Spanish and Portuguese navigators. However, other parts of the map are confused or conjectural, especially at the map's edges where knowledge was sparse. Notably, the southernmost portion of the South American coastline is drawn very oddly. On Piri's map, the coast of South America runs south to about present-day Rio de Janeiro, and then it bends eastward at a sharp 90-degree angle, heading toward the map's bottom right. This hooked appendage forms a landmass at the bottom of the map, depicted with jagged coasts and a cluster of islands off its shore. Because this stub extends far east of South America's true longitude, early analysts struggled to identify it with any known lands. What was Piri Reis trying to portray in this enigmatic section of his map? One straightforward interpretation is that this feature was Piri's imperfect attempt to chart the far south regions of the New World, areas unknown in 1513. It might represent a misplacement of South America's southern tip, for example, an elongated Patagonia or Tierra del Fuego drawn erroneously east-west, combined with the era's common belief in a large Terra Australis to the south. In the early 16th century, many European maps included a speculative southern continent, Terra Australis incognita, to balance the known land masses of the northern hemisphere, an idea originating with Ptolemy. Piri may have grafted such hypothetical land onto the bottom of South America. Indeed, it was not yet known whether South America was attached to some southern land or separated by water. Magellan's voyage to the Pacific, which would reveal the Strait of Magellan and Tierra del Fuego in 1520, had not occurred yet. Thus, Piri's portrayal could be a cartographic guess. Supporting this, an Ottoman map by Lopo Homem, 1519, similarly shows the coast of South America merging into a southerly continent. On the Piri Reis Map fragment itself, Ottoman Turkish notes give clues about this mysterious region. One marginal inscription near the elbow of the coastline describes how Portuguese explorers, blown off course by a storm, encountered a shore with people walking, all of them naked, who shot arrows with fishbone tips. The note says they stayed 8 days, trading by signs, before returning to Portugal with reports of these lands. This appears to record a sailor's tale of being driven far south, possibly describing contact with indigenous people, who could be South American Patagonians or similar, given the description. Another note in the same area, as translated, remarks that there is no trace of cultivation, everything is desolate, and big snakes are said to be there. The climate is very hot. Piri adds that the Portuguese did not land there for this reason, presumably the unfriendly wildlife and heat. These details, naked inhabitants, tropic-like heat, and snakes, sound far more like tropical or temperate South America than Antarctica. It is highly telling that the map's own annotations contradict an Antarctic interpretation. Antarctica has no indigenous people, snakes, or a very hot climate. In fact, as one scholar dryly notes, the map's region, being described as very warm, indicates it was perhaps around 50 degrees south latitude, not in polar latitudes where days are rarely very warm. All this evidence strongly suggests Piri and his sources believed this land to be a continuation of the New World, or an adjacent, unknown land, not an icebound polar continent. Claims of an Antarctic coastline on the map. Despite the above context, a dramatic claim arose in the mid-20th century that the Piri Reis Map's odd southern landmass is actually a depiction of Antarctica's coastline, shown in exquisite detail long before Antarctica's discovery. This idea seems to have originated with Arlington H. Mallory, an engineer and amateur historian, and was later popularized by Professor Charles H. Hapgood in his 1966 book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. Hapgood's hypothesis was extraordinary. He argued that Piri's map, and other old maps, were based on even more ancient charts made by an unknown advanced civilization, one that mapped the world, including Antarctica, when global sea levels and ice cover were very different. According to Hapgood, the map shows the Queen Maud Land coast of East Antarctica as it would appear ice-free, suggesting that whoever made the original source map did so when Antarctica's coast was unfrozen, and perhaps at a different position on the globe. Hapgood and his students undertook a detailed analysis, trying to align the Piri Reis map with modern coordinates. They noted that the map shows what looked like the Andes Mountains along South America's west, a feature Europeans hadn't documented by 1513. The Andes were first sighted by Pizarro in the 1520s. From this, Hapgood surmised Piri's sources included unknown ancient maps of South America. Turning to the far south, they pointed out what seemed to be the Falkland Islands on the map, also not officially discovered until 1592, just offshore of the east-turning coastline. If those islands were indeed the Falklands, Hapgood argued, then the land south of them, almost surely, had to be Queen Maud Land, Antarctica. He was struck by what he thought was a striking similarity between the outline of Piri's supposed southern continent and the modern coast of Queen Maud Land when plotted on a globe. After making complicated calculations, applying what he believed were the map's latitudinal-longitudinal corrections, Hapgood asserted that the Piri Reis depiction was accurate to within 20 miles of the real Antarctic coast in that sector. Furthermore, Hapgood's team interpreted some symbols on the map in light of Antarctica. For instance, at the bottom right of Piri's map, they identified a small cluster of islands drawn in the ocean. These were shaded heavily, which in Piri's cartographic style might indicate mountainous terrain. Hapgood noted that a seismic survey of the Antarctic seabed off Queen Maud Land, conducted in 1949 by a Norwegian-British-Swedish team, had discovered an undersea mountain range in that area. If the Antarctic ice cap were removed and sea levels adjusted, Hapgood believed those peaks would emerge from the sea as islands, matching the islands drawn on Piri's map. To him, this was tantalizing evidence that the original source maps were made when Antarctica was free of its ice cap, showing coastal mountains and islands now hidden. Hapgood even found a second old map, the Orontius Phineas map of 1531, that depicted a large southern continent. He claimed the Phineas map also showed rivers and bays in Antarctica's interior, suggesting an ice-free condition in the ancient past. Combining these clues, Hapgood proposed that Antarctica had been partially ice-free until around 4000 BC and fully ice-free around 17,000 BC, allowing some advanced culture, perhaps the Atlanteans, in some interpretations, to chart its coasts. Such ideas found an eager audience in the fringe literature. Eric von Däniken, Graham Hancock, and others repeated Hapgood's claims as evidence of lost civilizations, or even extraterrestrial influence. In summary, proponents of the Antarctica hypothesis argue that the Piri Reis map's southern extension closely matches Antarctica's Queen Maud Land, especially when adjusted for map projection, implying genuine knowledge of Antarctic geography. Hapgood's team believed the correspondence was within a few tens of miles of accuracy. The map allegedly shows Antarctic mountain ranges and islands that are now hidden under ice or sea, which could only have been known if the source maps were made when Antarctica's coast was ice-free. Hapgood cited the correspondence of Piri's islands with subglacial mountains detected by seismic surveys. Therefore, the map is taken as evidence that Antarctica was explored and mapped in remote prehistory, around the end of the last ice age, 15 to 20,000 years ago, or earlier, by a civilization capable of global navigation. This is often tied to speculation about ancient high civilizations or Atlantean peoples who could have existed before the historical record. These claims are extraordinary. If true, they would upend much of what we know about both history and Earth's geological past. Do they hold up under scrutiny? To find out, we must compare the map to real geography and consider what modern science says about Antarctica's condition 20,000 years ago. Antarctica and global sea levels. During the last glacial maximum, LGM, roughly 21,000, 18,000 years ago, was the peak of the last ice age, when ice sheets were at their greatest extent. Global temperatures were on average about 6 degrees colder than today. Huge ice sheets covered much of North America, Northern Europe, and Asia. Antarctica, being a polar continent, was, and had long been, covered by a massive ice sheet, just as it is today. In fact, during the LGM, the Antarctic ice sheet was probably slightly larger and thicker than now, with ice extending to cover most of the continental shelf area. This is evidenced by geological data indicating the ice sheet's grounding line extended further offshore at that time. Antarctica was certainly not ice-free 20,000 years ago. Quite the opposite. It was fully glaciated and contributed to the overall drop in global sea level. Global sea levels during the LGM were about 120–125 meters lower than today. Enormous volumes of water were locked in ice sheets, so coastlines worldwide were exposed further out to sea. For example, the Bering Land Bridge connected Siberia and Alaska. Sunderland, the present-day Indonesian shelf, was a vast exposed subcontinent. If we focus on Antarctica, a 120-meter lower sea level would expose some of the continental shelf around Antarctica as dry land, if it wasn't under ice. However, because the Antarctic ice sheet was then larger, much of that land was likely still under ice rather than open coast. In any case, modern reconstructions indicate that the coastline of Antarctica at the LGM mostly coincided with the outer shelf edges, not radically different in outline from today's ice front, except extending somewhat farther out in places where today's ice shelves, e.g. the Ross and Weddell sea shelves, now float. Importantly, Antarctica's climate history shows that it has been continuously ice-covered for millions of years. Ice core and geologic evidence suggest the last time Antarctica might have had largely ice-free conditions was on the order of 10,000 to 15 million years ago, not any time in human prehistory. During the most recent deglaciation, 15,000 to 8,000 years ago, there were significant retreats of ice in some parts of Antarctica. For example, the West Antarctic ice sheet thinned and retreated, contributing to meltwater pulse 1A sea level rise around 14,000 years ago. But even then, Antarctica did not become remotely ice-free. It simply lost some of the expanded ice that had grown during the glacial maximum. No scientific evidence exists that Antarctica was free of its ice cap 20,000 years ago. To the contrary, ice was more extensive then. Hapgood's belief that Antarctica was partially ice-free as late as 4000 BC is erroneous. In reality, by 4000 BC, 6,000 years ago, Antarctica was just as ice-covered as today. Earth's climate then was actually warmer than now, but not enough to melt the polar ice sheets. Thus, the fundamental premise that an ice-free Antarctic coastline existed for ancient mapmakers to record in 10,000–20,000 BP is flawed. What if one imagines, as Hapgood did, some scenario like a crustal displacement shifting Antarctica out of the polar circle in the late Pleistocene? Mainstream geology finds no evidence of such an event in the last 100,000 plus years. The Antarctic ice sheet's continuous presence means any accurate depiction of an ice-free Antarctic coast would have to date back millions of years, utterly impossible for any human civilization to have observed. As the Archaeology Review bluntly puts it, accepting that Piri's map shows an ice-free Antarctica implies believing human seafarers were mapping the world 15+ million years ago, which is preposterous given everything we know from the fossil and archaeological records. In short, from a geological standpoint, the notion that the Piri Reis Map accurately preserves a snapshot of Antarctica around 20,000 years ago, or even 6,000 years ago, is implausible in the extreme. But let's set aside those big-picture issues and examine the map itself more closely. Does the Piri Reis Map actually resemble Antarctica's geography in any meaningful way? And could it be reflecting any features that correspond to now submerged lands, e.g., lower sea level coastlines, or islands that existed during the LGM? Comparing the map's Antarctic coast to reality, when we directly compare Piri Reis's drawn coastlines with modern maps, the supposed Antarctica correspondence falls apart. Cartographic analyses have shown that the map's southern landmass simply does not match Antarctica, either in position, shape, or key features, location and orientation. On Piri's map, the southern land is attached to South America, with no gap, and it lies at a latitude far too north to be Antarctica. If one tries to overlay the map on a globe, This land is located roughly where the Strait of Magellan and Tierra del Fuego are in reality, around 50 dargs, not at 70 dargs where Queen Maud Land would be. In fact, it appears Piri drew the coastline several hundred kilometers north of Antarctica's actual position. This is a glaring discrepancy. One can't simply slide the Piri Reis southern land down to Antarctica without breaking the map's geometry. The latitude markings, rhumb line intersections, etc., on the map indicate Piri's southern land was meant to be at the latitude of southern South America, not the South Pole. Continuity, no Drake Passage. The Piri Reis Map shows the landmass continuous with South America. There is no open water gap where the Drake Passage lies. In reality, a 600-mile-wide strait separates South America from Antarctica, between Cape Horn and the Antarctic Peninsula. This passage was totally absent on Piri's map. The coastline just runs unbroken in a huge eastward curve. If an ancient mapmaker had truly charted Antarctica, they would have noted a separation, unless Antarctica were connected to S America by a land bridge, which it wasn't during the LGM or any time recent. Drake Passage has been open for 23 million years. Hapgood's theory effectively ignores this problem, but as one critic quips, you can't seize on an accidental resemblance of a coastline shape and ignore the fact that the map fails to show the Drake Passage at all. That omission alone is basically fatal to the Antarctica idea. It indicates the mapmaker had no knowledge of the true geography of the area. Shape mismatch. Even the resemblance that Hapgood claimed is highly debatable. Modern analyses overlaying the Piri Reis outline with Antarctica find little similarity. For instance, geologists Paul Heinrich and others compared the mapped coastline to Antarctica's sub-ice topography and found no significant similarities. In one overlay, see figure below, the Piri Reis southern outline was plotted against South America and Antarctica in a realistic projection. The result shows that nothing aligns. The map's peninsula and bays don't match the Antarctic peninsula or embayments, and major features like the Weddell Sea coastline or Ross Sea are absent. It especially does not match the supposed ice-free Antarctic coast that Hapgood imagined. Ironically, the known subglacial coastline of Antarctica, if the ice were removed, is mostly similar to today's ice coastline, and Piri's map matches neither one. For example, Queen Maud Land on a real map is a fairly straight coast-oriented east-west along 70 degrees, whereas Piri's land has a different curvature and lies along what would be 40-45 degrees. The claimed mountainous peninsula, Palmer Peninsula, on Piri's map is more likely just the northeastern shoulder of South America, perhaps drawn distorted, rather than any Antarctic feature. Missing submerged features. Hapgood asserted the map showed islands corresponding to subglacial peaks, but many actual Antarctic coastal features are missing on Piri's map. If one truly thought it depicted Antarctica, one must ask, where are the large islands at the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula or in the Weddell Sea? For instance, today we know of Alexander Island, a huge island separated by an ice shelf from the peninsula, and various islands off Queen Maud Land, but none of these appear on Piri's map. Likewise, the map doesn't indicate the major embayment of the Ross Sea or any equivalent, features one might expect an ancient survey to capture if it had mapped all of Antarctica's coast. Instead, Piri's land is relatively featureless, except for some generic bays and the small islands Hapgood fixated on. This patchy correspondence is more consistent with a composite of guesswork and partial data, as would be the case if it's Terra Australis plus South America, than with a genuine detailed survey of Antarctica. Climate and fauna notes. As mentioned earlier, the descriptive notes on the map utterly conflict with Antarctica. The presence of snakes and a hot climate in the annotations is difficult to reconcile with an Antarctic interpretation. Piri even drew a picture of a snake, or dragon, on that land, highlighting the point that it was thought of as a dangerous tropical locale. If this were Antarctica, how would one account for these? Hapgood's supporters sometimes argued that maybe very hot was relative or a translation issue, but that's special pleading. The simplest explanation is that the region described was somewhere in South America, perhaps a feverish equatorial coast, or an exaggeration of Patagonia, certainly not a frozen polar wasteland. In light of these discrepancies, virtually all scholarly and scientific analyses conclude that the Piri Reis Map does not depict Antarctica. Gregory Mackintosh, a historian of cartography who exhaustively studied the map and its sources, found that the supposed Antarctic coast is drawn hundreds of kilometers north of its proper location, and that the Drake Passage is completely missing, with the Antarctic Peninsula presumably conflated with the western Patagonian coast. He also points out that serious scholarship finds no reason to believe this area is based on any genuine Antarctic knowledge. Instead, it's likely a mix-up of known coasts and imagined ones. So what then is the Piri Reis Map's mysterious southern land actually showing? Modern investigators have advanced far more mundane explanations that fit the evidence better: a distorted South America and Tierra del Fuego. Some experts suggest that the lower part of the map is simply an extension of South America drawn incorrectly. If one unbends the coastline, rotating that eastward appendage back to a north-south alignment, it aligns much better with real geography. In fact, when the Piri Reis coastline is adjusted in this way, features of the Argentine coast become recognizable, such as the Gulf of San Matias, Valdez Peninsula, and San Jorge Gulf on Argentina's Patagonian coast. This would mean Piri, or his source, had some reports of the coast farther south than Spanish explorers had officially reached by 1513. The Falkland Islands, Islas Malvinas, also appear to be drawn. In the map's lower right, southern Atlantic, there are large and small islands that correspond well to the Falklands' position when the map is rotated. Indeed, researchers note, the map has large islands and small islands in the lower right, matching the Falkland archipelago. If true, this is fascinating. It suggests Portuguese or Spanish sailors might have unknowingly encountered the Falklands or heard of them prior to their recorded discovery in 1592. There are historical hints that Magellan or others might have had knowledge of the strait and nearby islands. Pigafetta wrote that Magellan already knew of a strait before discovering it, implying secret Portuguese info. Terra Australis and unknown southern land. It's also possible that beyond a certain point, the map stops representing real coastline and instead transitions into the realm of mythical geography. Medieval and Renaissance cartographers often drew a large southern continent based on no direct data. Piri Reis, being aware of contemporary ideas, could have chosen to connect South America to a supposed southern landmass, Terra Australis, simply because many thought such land had to exist. The southernmost part of the map might therefore be an imaginative extrapolation, essentially, here be Terra Australis. Supporting this, the Johannes Schöner globe of 1515 and other early 16th century maps show a similar big continent attached to South America's tip. If Piri's sources included such maps or theories, he might have merged them into his compilation, Tierra del Fuego, Land of Fire. The mention of fires and calling the land the country of fire in some accounts is intriguing. The maritime historian in Maritime Goods magazine speculates that the part labelled with snakes and described as hot could be a misinterpreted account of Tierra del Fuego, which Magellan famously named for the fires seen in native camps along the shore. Piri's note about a place abandoned and full of snakes could have been a corrupted tale about some Fuegian or Patagonian location, or even an island like Ilha de Cobras, Snake Island, off Brazil, mistakenly relocated on the map. In any case, nothing in that description suggests an icy land. It suggests a wild land in a temperate climate, which fits Patagonia, Tierra del Fuego better. Piri likely had sailors' notes from voyages that went down the Argentine coast and perhaps just cited the entrance of a strait or new lands, even if they didn't understand what they found. He then incorporated those notes, but under the influence of the Terra Australis idea, connected them to a larger southern continent. To visualize this, consider the following overlay, which shows how Piri Reis's southern section can be realigned with the actual map of the South Atlantic. Figure. Overlay comparison of Piri Reis's map with modern geography. The fragment of Piri's map, right rotated for alignment, is superimposed on a modern map of the Atlantic, left. Green highlights indicate island positions. Notably, the islands drawn by Piri match the location of the Falkland Islands, circled, once the coastline is bent back to a north-south orientation. This suggests the map's mysterious southern land was likely intended as the continuation of South America, Patagonia, Tierra del Fuego, not Antarctica. As the figure and analysis show, the Piri Reis Map's features align far better with South America's geography, with some distortion, than with Antarctica. What Hapgood thought was Queen Maud Land could instead be the Atlantic coast of Argentina, curving into the entrance of the Magellan Strait. The clear view of San Sebastian Bay, a bay on Tierra del Fuego's north shore, can even be discerned by some experts in the map. In this interpretation, the Antarctic portion is simply the eastern part of Tierra del Fuego, drawn erroneously as contiguous land stretching east, a reasonable mistake given nobody had yet sailed around Tierra del Fuego to know it was an island separated from any southern continent. In sum, when scrutinized with modern data, the claim that the Piri Reis map precisely mirrors an Ice Age Antarctica does not hold up. The supposed match is superficial and requires cherry-picking. Proponents focus on a vague similarity in one segment of coastline, but ignore the overwhelming inaccuracies, wrong location, no Drake passage, climate notes, etc. This kind of selective reasoning has been lampooned as rule number 1 for interpreting ancient maps. If you want a bestseller, if something on the old map looks like a modern feature, claim secret knowledge. If it doesn't match, just ignore it. In contrast, genuine scholarship, guided by what the map gets right about known regions, finds that Piri's map is only as good as its Renaissance sources allowed, brilliant for its time, but not miraculously prescient about unknown lands, submerged lands and ancient shorelines. Is anything 20,000 years out of place? Another aspect of the hypothesis worth examining is whether the Piri Reis map shows any island chains or coastal configurations that correspond to known paleogeographic features, i.e., lands that did exist during the LGM, 20k years ago, but are now submerged under higher seas. If the map were based on extremely ancient sources, we might expect to see traces of Ice Age coastlines, for example, larger areas of continental shelf exposed or islands that later sank beneath rising seas. Given that global sea level was than 120 mm lower in the Ice Age, certain modern shallow areas were land back then. However, Piri's map, being largely of the Atlantic, would only potentially reveal that in regions his sources mapped. Let's consider a few possibilities. Continental shelves. In 1513, European maps already showed the general outline of coastlines as known in their day, which of course correspond to present sea level. If Piri's map had somehow preserved a memory of LGM shorelines, we might see coastlines drawn further out to sea, encompassing today's continental shelf. There is no clear evidence of this. For instance, the map's depiction of the African and South American coasts closely matches their modern positions, not an expanded outline that would indicate knowledge of exposed shelves. If anything, some parts of Piri's South America are less accurate than modern, e.g. missing the taper of southern Brazil, but not in a way that matches LGM land extensions. It's just mapping error. Now submerged islands. Are there any islands on Piri's map that do not exist today, but could have existed with lower sea levels? Piri includes many Atlantic islands known then, Azores, Canaries, Madeira, etc., and a few legendary ones. One example is Antillia, a mythical island often shown on earlier maps west of the Azores. However, Piri's map doesn't clearly show Antillia. That portion of the North Atlantic might be missing in the fragment, or he omitted it. The Falkland Islands we discussed were actually real and above sea level both now and during the LGM. They aren't submerged today. Piri may depict them, which is remarkable, but it doesn't indicate Ice Age knowledge, just possibly earlier exploration than recorded. What about Hapgood's notion that the small island cluster in the far south are peaks of mountains that were above water in the Ice Age? This is problematic. The undersea mountains Hapgood referenced off Queen Maud Land are not shallow seamounts just below the surface. They lie beneath an ice shelf and ocean in a region that even with 120 meters lower seas would still be underwater. And moreover, if we remove the ice weight, the land would rebound up. But that process takes thousands of years after deglaciation. Hapgood also neglected the effect of post-glacial rebound. If Antarctica were deglaciated, the land would rise, altering the coastline configuration significantly over time. His assumption that Piri's map conveniently captured a stable moment of ice-free conditions is thus very suspect. Modern studies, with satellite radar and extensive seismic mapping, have mapped Antarctica's bedrock and coastline under the ice, and they find no convincing match to the Piri Reis Islands or bays. In other words, those shaded islands on Piri's map do not correspond to any known cluster of above sea level terrain in Antarctica's past 20,000 years. It's more likely they were either fictional embellishments by the mapmaker or mislocated drawings of known islands. For example, some have speculated they could represent islands off South America, like the South Georgia or South Sandwich Islands, which were unknown in 1513 but do exist, though their placement and number don't quite fit either. As for other submerged lands, Doggerland, the submerged North Sea plains that connected Britain to Europe in the Ice Age, and Sunderland, the connected Southeast Asia, are irrelevant here, as Piri's map doesn't cover those areas, and they were beyond the knowledge of the sources he used. There's no hint that Piri had any data on, say, an extended Florida coastline, or a dry Caribbean shelf that would differ from what 16th century Europeans knew. Indeed, Piri's depiction of the Caribbean is highly distorted. He rotated Cuba and placed islands incorrectly, likely due to compiling conflicting Spanish charts. If an Ice Age imprint were present, we might see something like a continuous land between Asia and Alaska, or a shrunken Caspian Sea, etc. But nothing of the sort appears since the map fragment is focused on the Atlantic region and the Old World. The conclusion here is that no identifiable feature on the Piri Reis map corresponds unambiguously to a now submerged landmass from 20,000 years ago. The features that some have tried to connect, e.g. alleged Antarctic islands, have been shown to lack real correspondence when scrutinized with geological data. The Falklands-like islands on the map do correspond to real islands, but those islands are still above water today, so not an LGM-only feature. The interesting part is simply that they may have been charted pre-1592 by unknown sailors. That speaks to Renaissance-era exploration, not to Ice Age geography. It's worth noting one more thing. Piri Reis was quite explicit about his sources, and none of them require invoking antediluvian civilizations. He credits Portuguese and Spanish maps and travel reports, and indeed we see their fingerprints. For example, the Portuguese rounding of Africa is well represented, and Columbus's Caribbean confusion is evident in the map's mistakes. Piri even wrote on the map that the Portuguese infidel related that in this spot, far south, the nights and days are very short, 2 hours at shortest, 22 at longest, but the day is very warm. This almost certainly came from a Portuguese report of high southern latitudes, perhaps around 50 degrees, where summer days are long. Crucially, Piri says this info came from a Portuguese, not from ancient sages or an Alexandrian library. In other words, the map itself explicitly says the information in this area came from European sources. So as one skeptic remarked, Atlanteans and extraterrestrials need not apply. What we likely have are isolated sightings of coast made by ships far off course and unsure of their location, which were then pieced together into the best guess Piri could draw. Under such circumstances, it's no wonder the map has wild inaccuracies in uncharted areas. Scholarly assessments and conclusions. Mainstream historians, geographers, and geologists who have studied the Piri Reis Map overwhelmingly refute the notion that it documents an ice-free Antarctica or any other 20,000-year-old geography. Here is a consensus of their findings, integrating historical and scientific insights. Historical cartography. Context. The map is a product of Renaissance-era knowledge. Scholars like Svatsuchek, 1996, and Gregory C. McIntosh, 2000, have traced nearly every element of the Piri Reis Map to earlier maps and data available by the early 1500 chalafmart.com. McIntosh, in particular, demonstrated that many peculiarities, like duplicated islands or errors in the North American coast, arise from Piri combining multiple source maps of differing quality. The supposed Antarctic section, when analysed, contains conspicuous errors that betray its true origin. It's drawn far too north and omits Drake Passage. These are exactly the kinds of errors one would expect from second-hand sailor reports and speculative geography in 1513, and not at all what one would expect if it were based on genuine ancient surveys of Antarctica. Serious historians thus conclude that nothing in the map's provenance or content requires a prehistoric civilization. It's much more parsimonious that Piri had access to some somewhat advanced, for the time, Portuguese map of South America's coast, maybe extending slightly beyond where the Portuguese officially sailed through rumour or accident, and that he combined this with the era's concept of a southern land. Geological, geophysical evidence. As discussed, all geological evidence indicates that Antarctica has been continually glaciated far longer than human history. No ice core, sediment, or sea level data support the existence of an ice-free Queen Maud land in 10 to 20 kABP timeframe. In fact, more recent studies show the Antarctic ice sheet was likely larger at the LGM and then retreated, but still remained covering Antarctica entirely. Also, if an advanced civilization had charted Antarctica 20k years ago, one might wonder, where is any other evidence of their existence? Cities, tools, etc. None has been found. The Piri Reis Map was held up as a singular smoking gun, but once that smoke clears, there is no fire beneath. No lost civilization is necessary to explain it, and none is evidenced elsewhere in the record. Critiques of Hapgood's methodology. Scholars have criticized how Hapgood reanalyzed the map. He and earlier researcher Mallory assumed that any errors on the map were due to copyists, and they attempted to correct the map to what they thought the original source looked like. This approach can easily introduce confirmation bias. By adjusting and rotating segments of the map until they resemble modern coasts, one can convince oneself of astounding accuracy, but those adjustments might be unwarranted. Mallory himself admitted he removed grid lines and imposed new ones to make the pieces fit. Essentially, Hapgood's team forced a fit with Antarctica by mathematically bending the map to their will. When objectively examined without such manipulation, the map simply does not line up with the Antarctic coast in any accurate way. It was also pointed out that the 1949 seismic data Hapgood cited was extremely limited, covering 1% of Queen Maud Land's coast, and was misinterpreted. Later, much more complete seismic and radar mapping found no special agreement with Piri's depiction. Hapgood further failed to account for isostatic changes, land rising after ice removal, which means even if Antarctica were ice-free long ago, its current coastal outline wouldn't exactly match what an ancient map would have recorded due to subsequent crustal rebound. Occam's razor. Known sources. Explain the map. The content on the Piri Reis Map can be explained by known explorations up to 1513, plus common cartographic conventions of the time. There's evidence that Piri included data from Portuguese voyages down the South American coast. Portugal had reached at least the Rio de la Plata estuary by 1512, and possibly further in secret. The mention of a Portuguese ship blown off course suggests first-hand knowledge of something in the far south. When these pieces are assembled, Piri's southern land is simply a composite of what had been glimpsed of Patagonia and perhaps Tierra del Fuego, melded with a hypothetical continent. There is no need to invoke Atlantis or aliens to account for any feature on the map. Nothing on it is unexplainable via 15th–16th century sources. In fact, rather than being inexplicably ahead of its time, the Piri Reis Map in parts lags behind or errs compared to other maps of the same era. For example, some earlier maps had a better sense of the continuous North American coastline, whereas Piri's confuses parts of the New World with Asia. This inconsistency undermines the notion that he had access to ultra-precise ancient charts. If he did, why do so many areas appear crude or mistaken? The map is best seen as a first-class piece of naval intelligence of 1513, showcasing what the Ottomans knew from European discoveries, rather than a repository of Ice Age secrets. After weighing all evidence, the balance of probability strongly discredits the idea that the Piri Reis Map faithfully records Antarctica's coastline from 20,000 years ago, or any time before the 16th century. The so-called accurate ancient geographical knowledge dissolves upon close inspection. What remains is still fascinating, but in a different way. The map is a testament to Renaissance ingenuity, to the global spread of information, even between rivals like European powers and the Ottoman Empire, and to the human tendency to fill unknown spaces with imaginative geography. Conclusion: the Piri Reis Map stands as a remarkable artifact of early modern cartography, but not as evidence of antediluvian civilization or lost Ice Age maps. Claims that it accurately depicts an ice-free Antarctica are unsupported by both the map's details and by geologic reality. The map's supposed Antarctic coastline is far more plausibly explained as a combination of misoriented South American geography and the era's mythic Terra Australis. Modern comparisons show little alignment between the map and Antarctica's true features once we account for projection and position. Furthermore, no feature on the map definitively corresponds to a known submerged LGM landmass in a way that exceeds what 16th century knowledge, or errors, can explain. On the contrary, the map's annotations and errors align it firmly with the age of discovery context, reflecting the knowledge and uncertainties of that time, rather than preserving any deep time secrets. In the end, the allure of the Piri Reis Map in fringe literature underscores our fascination with the past and the hope that perhaps some vestige of a grand forgotten chapter of history might survive. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. In this case, the evidence, when carefully and comprehensively examined, points not to a 20,000-year-old legacy, but to the skill and daring of 16th century explorers and cartographers. The true story of the Piri Reis Map is already plenty impressive. It's a compendium of Renaissance world knowledge, compiled by an Ottoman admiral who leveraged every source at his disposal to chart the still emerging picture of the globe. That accomplishment does not need anachronistic mystique to be worth celebrating. As one analysis concluded, if we credit Piri Reis for what he actually did, synthesizing new discoveries onto one map, we find a sailor far ahead of his time, but not beyond the constraints of his time. In short, the Piri Reis Map is a marvel of 1513, not of 20,000 BC, and it tells a story of early modern exploration, not Ice Age cartography. If you've made it this far, you're officially a legend, and your curiosity is what makes this channel tick. Remember, today's report isn't the final word, just another piece of a much bigger puzzle. Drop your suggestions below. What mystery or topic should we explore next? Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and thanks for riding along with FastTrackAI.